Hi, everyone. Thanks for showing up. I'm just going to do some little tweaking. David, I'm going to spotlight you,
Cool.
and I'm going to spotlight myself so it makes it easier for people to see us. Okay. And okay, a few other people are coming in, but we are going to get started. So thanks everyone for showing up tonight. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 Facebook group. And I'm here tonight with David Blowbaum from Summit Prep. And we're going to talk about test prep and particularly test optional, or maybe we should change it these days to who's test becoming test required, with all the changes that are happening. And David has some information and slides he's going to share with you, and then we're open to answering questions. And let me just do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll officially start. This is actually technically a Zoom meeting, and I only say that because everybody has come in muted. So unless you really have a question that you don't want to share in chat, if you could keep yourself muted, that would be helpful. I always put out the plea, if anybody wants to put on their video, it's nice to see people's faces, but can understand if you're doing lots of stuff and just want to listen, that's fine too. This is recorded, and we will send the recording tomorrow. And please feel free to put questions in the chat. Depending on the question, I might interrupt David, but if not, we will definitely get to questions at the end. And David generously said that he is willing to and can stay as long as people have questions. So hopefully we can answer a lot for people. And if you could put into the chat what year your student is in high school, that would be great. And also kind of where you're Zooming from. Always love to know that. Okay. So great. Oh, we've got a junior. Oh, how do you know which schools are test out? We'll talk
Perfect
about
question.
that. Yep. Sophomore. Great. Lots of people from all over the place. Good. Thank you for sharing. Okay. Okay, so let me give a little quick bio on David, and then I'll let him share his slides. So David is an expert on testing and college admissions. He's the founder of Summit Prep, a member of the ACT's, you're also a member of the ACT Executive Advisory Council, a board member of the National Test Prep Association, and director of outreach for the National Test Prep Association. And you've done over 70 TV, radio, podcast appearances, and have written op-eds published in the Chicago Tribune, Inside Higher Ed. And for those of you who don't know, Inside Higher Ed is a well-known educational industry publication. The Hill, NASDAQ, and several other places. So thank you, David, for being here tonight. And you definitely have a ton of experience. So we're excited to hear what you have to share with everybody.
Fantastic. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. So I'm going to share my screen, and the slides, it takes me usually around 25 minutes to get through everything. It just depends how much I nerd out on things. So it could be a little bit longer or shorter. Actually, you know what? I'm going to unshare really quickly and share again. I want to make sure that I'm able to share my audio for this. Okay, so let's try sharing again. All right. So we're going to go over testing and college admissions. And the way that I like to start this off is actually with a video from Jeff Salingo. So Jeff Salingo, for those who don't know him, he's the premier test expert in the country on testing and college admissions. So we'll start with Jeff Salingo.
I'm not a fan of test optional because I either say you accept the test or you don't accept the test. There's this vast middle ground and nobody knows what it means. Is test optional optional? Well, if you really look at the statistics when they share them, if you really talk to admissions deans, they'll say it. I think it's optional for some students, but not others. And what do I mean by that? Like if you go to if you are going into a major where they really want to know, can you do the work? What does that mean? if you're majoring in STEM and business, and we know this again from the statistics, those students tend to submit scores at a much higher rate. So at some universities where I've seen the statistics, people who are majoring in STEM and business, their submission rates might be 90+%. Where somebody majoring in English or the humanities, it might be less than 50%.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of test optional.
Okay, so there's a lot there that we're going to break down. And just Debbie, can you hear me actually?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
problem.
Because
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Zoom just disappeared for me, so I was just wondering. All right, perfect.
Oh, okay.
All
Yeah.
right. So, all right. So really, last year, the New York Times did a piece called "The Misguided War on the SAT," and that sparked a return of testing in a lot of ways, not just from test required schools that went back to test required, but even among test optional colleges, that really gave them the opening to go back to test preferred. And in that, so that article from the New York Times was premised on Opportunity Insights data on all of the Ivy and Ivy Plus colleges. And that data found that high school GPA alone explained 5% of a student's first year GPA. Not much. So 95% was not explained by a student's high school GPA. The SAT alone explained 19.3% of a student's first year GPA in one of those Ivy Plus colleges. So that's 3.9 times more predictive. When you add in SAT plus high school GPA, it actually only goes up to 19.6% predictive capacity. So at those top colleges, you're only gaining 0.3 predictive capacity from adding in high school grades. So test scores vastly more predictive at those top schools. So that's why we see a test required returning, especially to some top schools. But families will ask, well, why are standardized test scores, especially at the top schools, so much more predictive? And the reason is grade inflation. So this is according to UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute. And they run a freshman survey. They've run it since 1966. In 1966, it was only about 20% of students had an A average who were going into a 4-year BA granting university. 80% didn't. Well, 2 years ago, 2023, it was just about 80% of students going into those 4-year BA granting universities had A averages, only about 20% didn't. So there's been a lot of grade inflation. Well, that would be fine if students were getting much better grades if their academic achievement was actually increasing that much. But the data say that's probably not the case. So ACT scores have dropped, especially since COVID. And what's actually been getting a decent amount of press is that the National Assessment of Education Progress, you might know that as the NAEP scores. They dub themselves the nation's report card. Those are showing 20 to 30% lows in educational achievement as well. So students are not as good on average at reading and mathematics, but we see that their grades are going up. So that's the grade inflation. Okay, so just adding on to that research is the statements from some top colleges. So we have Harvard has said SAT and ACT scores are better predictors of Harvard grades than our high school grades. Yale, it turns out actually that the SAT or the ACT is the single best predictor of a student's academic performance at Yale. Brown, same thing. Duke is test optional, but really, test optional as far as Duke goes. They even say on their website, buy a study guide and begin taking practice SAT and ACT tests. And perhaps the most telling is Emory. Emory's dean, John Ladding, in 2023 said, "We're not as trusting, frankly, of GPA these days. Emory is weighing external assessment more heavily than GPA, with a particular focus on AP scores." Now, that's a mind-blowing statement for anyone who's, in the higher ed space, because the line has always been, no, we view grades as significantly more important than test scores. Basically, everyone has said that for decades and decades. So to hear a dean of admissions say, no, we're actually looking at test scores more than grades is mind-blowing in and of itself. But then that's further surprising that he's saying with a particular focus on AP exam scores, because AP exam scores were historically really just for college credit. They weren't really used in the admissions process because you can only get a 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 on them. So there's not a lot of granularity in the scores. So they're not really designed for college admissions. So to say that they're going to use test scores more than grades, to say that they're going to use AP exam scores very heavily in their admissions process. And what's most surprising, Emory is test optional. So, as someone asked in the chat, how do we know if a school is test optional or, really test preferred? That's what we're going to go into. So really, we can break testing policies up into test required. That's pretty straightforward. Test preferred, truly test optional, and test blind-ish. We'll get to that ish. There's a big test blind-ish. But I should state at this point, I've only been referencing really, very selective and highly selective schools. The vast majority of the over 2,000 colleges in the country, so we're talking about like 75% of colleges roughly have about a 75% acceptance rate. So the vast majority of schools are test optional, and the vast majority of schools are truly test optional. So it's always good to keep in mind if your child, is not a great test taker. Well, first of all, it's probably that they really just need to learn the content. But really, if they are just really a bad test taker, there are great schools that they can get into that are still test optional. But we're going to focus on the selectives and highly selectives. So how do you know if they're, test preferred or truly test optional? A good place to start is the common data set. So if you're taking notes, I would just take this down that you want to type in the words common data set into Google and type in the school's name. So common data set, Stanford, for instance. Then the really important parts of that common data set, you can just do, the search feature and go to C7 and C9. That's where all the really helpful testing in admissions information is at. So for instance, this was Stanford's 2023 common data set. This was when Stanford has now gone back to test required, but this is when Stanford was test optional. Notice they listed standardized test scores as very important, the same as GPA, class rank, etc. So when you look at their admissions criteria and they say, hey, test scores are very important or important, even if they're test optional, they're saying they're test preferred. All right, so this is a really good place to look. And then, so I like to break test required into, I would lump test required and test required with rare exceptions under both functionally required. So again, there's the straightforward test required. Harvard, Stanford, Yale, MIT, Caltech. Caltech actually jumped from test blind all the way to test required with no advance notice, etc. This year so far, University of Miami has gone back to test required, and just 4 days ago, University of Pennsylvania went back to test required. And then there's over 100 other colleges that are test required. But again, vast majority of schools are not. Then I would call the other schools test required with rare exceptions. So you can also find this information in the common data set. So when you look up in the common data set, what percent of enrolled students submitted test scores, you can get an indication of how important test scores are. So this is Duke, 47% submitted SAT scores. This was last admission cycle. 46% submitted ACT scores.
So David, can I just emphasize for people,
Yes.
because I think this might all be new, that they're seeing and understanding the common data set. So what David is showing, these percentages, are the students who have been accepted and then decided to enroll. It's 47% of the students who enrolled also had submitted their SAT or ACT scores. So the number that we don't have, because the colleges just don't share it, is we don't know what percentage of students who applied also submitted their test scores. They just don't share it. But you could make an assumption, because if these are the people who got accepted and enrolled and it's so high, then you can only imagine that the students who actually submitted, were also on the higher side. And obviously of the students who they submitted, they kind of lean towards picking more of the students who actually submitted their test scores, and those are the students who ultimately enrolled. So I'm just giving people some context.
No, that's extremely helpful. Yes. So, you know, and just to emphasize that, so you're exactly right, Debbie, that very few schools will tell you really what you need to know in order
Right.
to understand is the applied, admitted, enrolled is actually really not what you're going for, right? If you're going to try and figure out the advantage, it's just like you can kind of get at it. So, Duke here, you add up 47 and 46, you get to 93. So 93% of enrolled students submitted test scores to Duke. Are you really part of that 7%? Probably not. Who's that 7%? It might be recruited athletes, children of, donors, or, some lawsuits have come out that have really helped draw back the curtain on just how much board members and donors, like that some applications are literally marked VIP and those kids are getting in. So that 7%, those students probably have a very strong hook to be getting into a college like Duke. But again, most schools are not like that. We mentioned very few schools will actually tell you the percent that applied and were admitted. Amherst is one of those few schools. Amherst tells us that 44% applied with test scores, 66% of those admitted submitted test scores. But when you do the math on that, it actually ends up being a 2.5% higher admit rate. So you 2.5x your chances by submitting not just any test scores, but good test scores if you're applying to Amherst. So, and then the percentage enrolled is always lower because those students who did submit test scores and were admitted, those students have a lot more options, generally speaking. So colleges yield those students at a lower rate. So it could be for Duke, for instance, that 98% of the students admitted submitted test scores and that 3% were the enrolled. So yeah, just something good to keep in mind. All right, so now we get to test preferred and test recommended. So some colleges are just honest, which is nice. So Ohio State, Auburn, they say we recommend that students take SAT or ACT scores. And when you look up in the common data set, if a school is 50% or above of enrolled, then they're very, very likely test preferred. Because in order to get 50% of enrolled students to have submitted test scores, they're probably more like 60 to 70% of their admitted students submitted test scores. So something to keep in mind. Okay, so then I have just a case study. I think University of Southern California is provides great insight into trying to figure out test optional, test preferred. So this is on USC's blog post they just did on December 17th, so 3 months ago. We know these are the buzzing questions in the back of your mind. So let's clear a few things up. When we say USC is test optional, we truly mean that. This is not a trick or a calculated ploy aimed at your downfall. It is up to you as the applicant to decide for yourself if you wish to have an exam considered, whether the SAT or ACT. So ironically, by saying that they were clearing things up, they actually said nothing at all. Because really what they just said is test optional means you have the option. It's like, I know. Like, you didn't clear anything up by clarifying that test optional means you have the option to submit test scores. But that's really what it means. Test optional purely means you have the option whether or not to submit test scores. It doesn't necessarily mean you won't be disadvantaged. Now, ironically, though, USC and a bunch of other schools, USC says on its website, applicants will not be penalized or put at a disadvantage if they choose not to submit SAT or ACT scores. Okay, so now you're thinking, whoa, they really are truly test optional. I won't have it held against me. But this was literally just 15 days ago. Kirk Brennan, their director of undergraduate admission, on the College Admissions Process podcast, said SAT and ACT scores help us. We do see value in using the number to help predict a student's first-year GPA. So again, I mean, are they truly test optional when they're saying these test scores help us? then when you actually look at not just what they say, which is ambivalent, but what they do, again, this is USC releasing this data. Percentage of applicants who submitted test scores, 36%. Percentage of admitted students who submitted test scores, 51%. So now whenever that admitted percentage is higher than submitted, than just applicants submitting, you know that there's a preference there. When you do the math on it, you almost 2x your chances of getting into USC. And this is a school that has gone to great lengths to say that it's truly test optional. So again, I think it actually in some ways comes down to common sense. Like, yes, you can use the common data set and all of that. But generally speaking, if a school is highly selective, they're probably test preferred. And I'll give more information on that as well. So, but now let's get to the actually truly SAT, ACT unnecessary. So again, the vast majority of schools are truly test optional. So Pepperdine, for instance, Pepperdine's a pretty decent school. But again, you look at their common data set, 19% and 3%. So 22% of their students submitted tests, of their enrolled students submitted test scores. That means 78% did not. You can absolutely get into Pepperdine without test scores. And that's a vast majority of schools. Now, I'm then going to go into, I don't call UCLA and UC Berkeley test blind, which they would refer to themselves as test free or test blind. I call them SAT, ACT blind very intentionally because UCLA and UC Berkeley, they use AP and IB exam scores. They've said on podcasts that they use those. And for international students, they use the A-level scores for students from the UK. So they're not test blind, they are SAT, ACT blind. If a school offers AP or IB classes at that school, UCLA, UC Berkeley, any even test blind colleges that are selective, they're expecting AP exam courses to be, or AP exam scores to be listed. And here's the reason why. So UCLA's 2023 admitted students, this is the last data that they've put out. If you look at the unweighted GPA of their admitted students, the median GPA was a 4.0 out of 4.0. So their average student has a perfect GPA. That's the average. And you see that their middle 25th to 75th percentile is 3.95 to 4.0. That means 75% had a 3.95 to 4.0. There's almost no variation in grades at all, again, because of grade inflation, because everybody applying to these top schools basically has a perfect GPA when you look at it unweighted, right? And there are a lot of schools that unweight GPA in the admissions process. And so, you know, that's another reason that all of those selective schools, well, not all, I shouldn't say, but the vast majority of those selective schools, they want to see a test score because how can they differentiate between students who have basically perfect grades? Okay, so when should you actually submit test scores? So again, look at the common data set and look at the school score range. It's going to tell you that middle 50th percentile. So if you're above that middle 50th percentile, absolutely submit. We even say if you're in that range between the 25th and 75th, definitely submit. So, you know, if you're below the median, your test score is not necessarily helping you, but we've found, at least from our students, that it doesn't hurt you as much as not submitting test scores to a selective institution. Below a 25th percentile, probably still don't submit, right? Like, are you hurting your chances? Probably, but you're probably going to hurt your chances even more if you submit a test score below their 25th percentile, especially if it's far below their 25th percentile, because they don't want to bring down their very high average. There's some exceptions, like if you're a first-gen student and you're applying to Yale and you have a 1450, well, 1450 is below their 25th percentile, but you're actually going to stand out more if you're a first-gen student with a 1450. So, you know, take it as a general rule of thumb. All right. And then we can also see, well, what are people actually doing? So this research was just published 18 days ago by Common App. So we see that in this last admission cycle that literally just ended, The applicants who reported no score, that dropped by 1%. Those applicants who did report a score, it jumped by 11%. So it's almost the same number did not report a score and reported a score. But when you really drill down into the data more, really it's the more affluent or privileged students, especially if you're, of a more, if you have more privilege, colleges tend to expect more of you, I would say rightly. So, when we see continuing generation applicants, that means not first gen. Well, then a majority of not first gen students, they submitted test scores in the college application process. And you saw a 7% jump in them doing so in the last cycle, and an 8% drop in them in applicants not doing so. So it's not just theoretical. Families are adapting to, what they've seen, that people submitting good test scores have a very large advantage, especially at the top schools. Okay, but there's also other considerations. So as Jeff Salingo alluded to at the beginning, it's not just about the school, it's also about the major. So very few schools give this level of data, but the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana does. So overall, across all their schools, 59% of enrolled students submitted test scores. So they are absolutely test preferred at University of Illinois, even though they're test optional. But you look at their School of Social Work, and only 28% of enrolled submitted test scores. So you can, very likely get into the School of Social Work there if you just have good grades or, another hook. But then you look at engineering, it's 81% of enrolled submitted test scores. So, their College of Engineering is very test preferred. Also, keep in mind that it's not just about getting in, and it's not just about getting into your college major, it's also about scholarships. So there are a lot of colleges that give automatic scholarships if you have a certain GPA and certain test score. And for the vast majority of schools, they're not test blind for the college scholarships, or for merit aid. Even if they're test optional, they could very likely be test preferred, especially for merit aid and scholarships. Last thing would be, if you take the SAT and ACT, sometimes you don't have to take placement tests. And this is across like a lot of schools that, even just a 20 on the ACT math can make it so you don't have to take a placement test at some schools to see where you place into the math. Okay. This is just basically an aside. One new expectation is, again, just at the selective, highly selective colleges, there's a new expectation that if you have an AP class listed on your transcript, you will submit a corresponding AP exam score on your application. So Yale has said, if your transcript shows that you have been enrolled in several AP classes before senior year and your application doesn't include any AP scores, we're going to wonder what's up. You do not want them wondering what's up, right? So the rule of thumb is, a 5 looks great. A 4 looks great to most schools. It's not going to impress at the top schools, but it'll, still submit a 4. Because if you don't submit a 4 or 5, they're going to assume it's a 3. And that's what not the vast majority, but a majority of AP exam scores, they're 3s or below. So if you're not listing an AP exam score, they're probably thinking it's a 3, a 1, 2, or 3. So Yale, Princeton, Georgetown, Notre Dame, as we talked about, UC Berkeley, UCLA, and there's some others as well that have made public statements. So, that concludes the presentation. This is our contact information. We're going to open it up for questions, and I'm going to try and figure out how to get Zoom back because I can't see anyone. So.
Okay, sorry we're leaving you in the dark, but
It's all good.
Okay, so let me ask some of the questions. So one of the first questions was, somebody said, I saw that we shared, and it's been on the on social media and other places, that UPenn is now requiring SAT scores. And the question is that for the class of 2026? Because some people might be like, wow, like my kid wasn't planning on taking tests, but they wanted to apply there. Now all of a sudden they have to rush and take the test.
No, luckily no. So it's just for the next admission cycle.
But that's for the class next, meaning.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, class of 2026. It is for,
Yes, then you need to rush and take the test.
Yeah. So it's for the students who are in 11th grade now. If you wanted to apply to UPenn, you're now going to need a test.
Yes, absolutely. And, I mean, the reason that they felt that they could make that change, really quickly is, one, if you're going to apply early, you have until, at most schools, November 1st. So you still have, 9 months until then, or roughly. But more importantly is that UPenn and other colleges have found that even when students weren't sending scores, the vast majority had taken a test score and they were choosing not to send them in. So UPenn doesn't feel like they're making students take the test. They just they feel like they're just making students send their scores.
Okay. A question about ACT and the changes. With the changes coming for the ACT, with the option for writing and science, will it hold any value to take the ACT without taking one of those sections?
Great question. So there's no reason to take the ACT writing unless, as a kind of trick to getting a seat, let's say all the seats are taken, try out selecting writing, and then voila, probably there's going to be a seat available closer to you. So the only reason I have my students sign up for writing is so they don't have to drive like an hour and a half to go take testing. But otherwise, no reason to take the writing. As far as the science, keep taking it for now. Colleges have not enough colleges have said what their policies are going to be. There are some schools in Florida that have said they're going to be science preferred, but really we don't know yet.
So David, if you sign up for writing and the student takes it, do you have to submit the writing score?
Oh, excellent question. No, you don't. So
right. So that's like, I mean, it obviously on the day of the test, it's extra work, but then you can decide whether or not you really want to submit it. If that opens up the where you can take the test.
Yeah, actually, I'm so glad you asked that because you don't even need to take it or submit it. So you literally pay for it.
Oh.
You pay $25 to basically then not drive further.
Oh, I didn't even realize you don't even have to really take it, even if you signed up for it.
Exactly.
You have to pay for it, so that they're getting you that way. But okay.
Right. So you'll get your writing packet as long as you don't break the seal on it. They don't score it. You won't get a 0. They just don't grade it at all. So you just tell the proctor, in advance of the test, hey, by the way, I'm not going to take the writing section. So, I'm just going to leave afterwards. And they're fine with that. You turn it in. It's all good.
Okay, interesting. So somebody is asking at the beginning of your slides, you talked about what percentage GPA kind of contributed to somebody's, the school's ability to figure out how you'll do at that college, and then what percentage the test score. So they were wondering, and they said, what explains the other 80% of a student's college performance? I don't know if you have any thoughts. I mean, I have some ideas, but I'll add them to yours.
Right. So that Opportunity Insights, it was it does break that down, and the biggest thing that you could do is just look at a student's high school. If you didn't have GPA and you didn't have test scores and you just looked at their high school, that would explain most of it, actually.
Well, and this person kind of with a question mark said zip code, which is a kind of a it complements what you're saying about high school is obviously that it's zip code dependent, but it's also the quality of the high school. But then, it is where the student is coming from and probably their parents' educational level.
Exactly. And so just by looking at what high school, you can probably tell, on average, in roughly the income of the family, the quality of the education, if you were just going to go based on any factor, you go based on where they graduated from. But we don't want to do that, right? Because that's not individualized, and that would really devastate disadvantaged students. I mean, if you came from an inner city high school, no college would ever look at you. So it's much fairer to use grades and test scores than it would just be, what high school are you coming from?
So here's a good question. Somebody's asking, so if a student really just doesn't perform well on tests, is the research saying that they won't be successful in college? Or is the predictor, is there a different predictor to differentiate students that even might have learning disabilities but can still do well in college?
So, I mean, I think I would want to understand it on more of a personal level, because there are students who, I've worked with who they genuinely are not good test takers, where they know the content, they have the knowledge and they have the skill, and they do not execute on test day, right? And I write letters for those students to the colleges they're applying to and say, I love the SAT and ACT, and this student is not a good test taker. They're that 20% of students where the SAT and ACT are really just not picking up their required knowledge and skill. But for the other 80% of students, it actually is a very good measure of their acquired knowledge and skill. And so the vast majority, 80% of students who think they're bad test takers, they actually, it's hard to say, they probably actually just don't have the knowledge and skill to get that higher score. The more of that knowledge and so what is that knowledge and skill? That knowledge and skill is the fundamentals of grammar, rhetorical skills, mathematics, reading, data analysis. The more of those fundamental skills you have, the more likely you are to succeed in college. So it's not guaranteed by any means. It, again, at the top schools, it is only explaining 19.3%. That means roughly 81% is not explained by the SAT and ACT. It's just on a comparative level better than grades. Also, grades in college measure a lot more than your knowledge and skill. They also measure your diligence. Did you show up to class, your class participation? So there's a lot more that go into college grades than just knowledge and skill.
But that's actually a good thing that you're bringing up, maybe to explain a little bit more. Like when students say, or even the parents say, well, my student's not a good test taker, and they kind of maybe like write it off, like, but there's really probably layers below that to really better explain what's causing them to think they're not a good test taker, and could that cause really be like worked on and improved?
Absolutely. And, and 80% of the time it can be, right? And well, I would say 100% of the time it can be, but sometimes that 20% of the time you're not going to see everything reflected in the score. But, our average student goes up 6 points on the ACT, just over 200 points on the SAT, and they're not doing that from tips and tricks. You cannot go up that much from tips and tricks. So, I see it firsthand. You learn the content, you develop those skills, you do better on the test. And, Debbie, what you and I talked about briefly is sometimes we find that a student had a learning disability. I mean, one of my favorite stories of all time with one of my students started with a 17 on the ACT. And I was like, no, this kid's actually incredibly smart. He was getting C's in school, which is like hard to get these days. And I was like, no, he needs extended time. He ended up getting not just 50% extended time, but 100% extended time. He had no idea how smart he was. He turned into a straight A student and got a 35 on the ACT. So from a 17 to a 35. And without these tests, he wouldn't have known that actually he's a very smart student who has very significant learning, setbacks. So long story short, you can improve your scores.
Yeah, I mean, and you're not the first kind of tutoring and test prep professional to kind of mention that to me. I've had others basically say that majority of the time when they work with a student who says, I'm not good at taking tests, it's really that they don't have the fundamentals,
Yeah.
And they don't feel secure in the actual material. And once they kind of figure out which of those areas they really need to improve, they kind of, it naturally reflects in better scores.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's see. Somebody's saying the school ACT next month is on paper. Okay. Is it worth the risk to take the written section in case this, or skip it in case the scores are good and the essay score is okay? So I guess we're still in the transition period, right? Where they can still take the ACT. It hasn't gone completely digital.
Right. And actually, that's a good point too. ACT, at least the CEO, Janet Godwin, has said that they're going to always keep a paper version for the ACT. So, at least that means for the next year, they'll have a paper version. So there will be a paper version and a digital version. In April, the digital version will become the new ACT. That paper version will continue to be the current ACT until September. And then in September, that paper version also becomes the new test. But to the point of that in-school exam, I mean, I wouldn't take the essay. You in a in-school exam, you might not be able to leave early, but I wouldn't even crack that seal on it because, the other reason I wouldn't is because I don't feel that the ACT essay in its current form is a good reflection of a student's writing ability. And technically, no colleges do this, but technically they can actually see that essay and they could compare it, your college application essays, that writing quality to your ACT essay. And there's always going to be a huge gap between that because the ACT is just not the place where you're going to produce a lot of really good writing. So personally, I would never take the ACT essay, long story short.
Somebody has a question about UT Austin or the University of Texas system, how they are auto admitting students who are in the top 5% of their schools, and this person's wondering if their student becomes in that top 5%, do they even really need to take test scores because they're going to be auto admitted into the Texas system?
Good question. I don't know. I'm not an expert on the Texas auto admitting. So, but
Yeah.
UT Austin, they say that they went back to test required. I would think you have to submit a test score, but I'm not sure. So,
oh, okay. So somebody is also asking for the AP classes, they don't necessarily have to take the AP exam. Like your student can sign up for an AP class, but they don't have to actually take the exam. Nobody forces them to take the exam. And so this parent is wondering if the student didn't take the exam, do you think that they should be telling the college why? Like, does that look strange that they took the class and they didn't actually take the exam?
it's a good question. So, I mean, I guess I would say it really depends on what colleges you're applying to, because again, like the expectation of seeing AP exam scores on the application is really just a new trend among the highly selective colleges. So, but for those highly selective colleges, if you didn't even take an AP exam, I would actually have your college counselor in the college counselor
That's a
letter
good point.
mention.
If there's a real reason why.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then and I wouldn't have it come from the student. I would have it come from, someone like a school authority who can actually say, yeah, no, the student didn't take the exam. So
Yeah.
then they won't wonder what's up because,
Right.
you explained it.
But hopefully, in all honesty, the other thing I would add is it depends on what your student might be interested in majoring in, and if they're applying to a certain school, like within the college. Like again, if your student is applying to engineering and they took the math AP classes and then ended up not taking the math AP test, I would explain that somehow. There better be a good reason why they didn't take the test, because that college wants to see as much as they can to know that you're a strong, STEM student if they're going to consider you for their engineering program. So kind of consider what the AP exam was and class that your student took and didn't take the exam, and also if that correlates with any of their particular interests and majors. Okay. If I took a practice test and scored comparably on the ACT and SAT, which would you advise spending 3 months to prepare for?
So you're going to get varied opinions on this. I would say the ACT. I think it's a more straightforward exam. I mean, the SAT was created as an aptitude test, meaning to correlate to IQ, and it was created in that way to give disadvantaged students to help open the doors to the top schools to disadvantaged students who didn't have a good education. So, hey, let's just measure IQ and let in, the most brilliant disadvantaged students. But that has all its tons of problems in and of itself. So, but and the ACT was created as an achievement test to just measure what you've learned. The SAT has become much more of an achievement test, but it still maintains some of its origins of being more of an IQ test. ACT is really just an achievement test. So by and large, if you learn the content, you're probably going to get the questions right on test day on the ACT. With the caveat, as long as you can work quickly, because it's a much more speeded exam. Whereas SAT, I find that it's harder to increase student scores on the SAT, especially on the verbal side. Math is a little easier to increase. The other thing to keep in mind is since the SAT changed last year, you're only graded on 90 questions, which is insane that 90 questions determine your score. So one or two, guesses right or wrong, and you're going to see very large fluctuations in your score. So I find that the SAT is a less reliable test than it used to be. So you just see more jumps up and down. So I have students who do the SAT and ACT, but I prefer all else being equal. ACT, you learn it, you're probably going to get it right. And for right now, it's a more reliable exam.
Okay, good explanation. Somebody is asking, they really liked all the data that you showed from University of Illinois. Do other colleges share that level of detail on their website for each major?
I have only seen one other college ever, and that's University of Pittsburgh.
Oh, I think
That's
I've seen, I think, and I don't want to be completely confident, University of Virginia might
Okay.
also break it down. It's actually, I don't think it's on their website because obviously the University of Virginia is a state school. I think that there's another website with a lot of state stats that they have to submit, and it might be there. But anyhow, I agree with David. Unfortunately, very, very few schools break down that level of data. And my gut, they have the data.
Oh, yeah.
They're looking at it, but they're not sharing it publicly.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about direct admit nursing schools? Somebody's wondering if submitting the SAT is enough, or do you have to submit both the SAT and ACT? And maybe you can just talk about that in general, like this idea of like, do all of the colleges, do they have a preference? Is it fine to choose one versus the other?
That's a good question. So I guess I'm a little bit confused about the direct admit because I would assume that you're already admitted based on, some schools will just literally like send you, hey, if you apply, you're admitted. So maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Oh, the direct admit to nursing means that it's a kind of combination. You get in to college and then you automatically be direct admitted into the nursing school. So it's all at once that you're getting that information.
Got it. Okay, that makes much more sense. Nursing is one of those majors that it's like engineering. You typically have to have submitted test scores. And the reason for that, so I would assume that if you're applying to anything that's to do with nursing, you probably want to submit test scores. And the reason for that, because there's a lot of testing in nursing. And so if you have
That's a very good point.
Let's say you're that 20% of student who you're very smart, very skilled, but test scores are they don't pick up your aptitude, your knowledge. Honestly, sadly, nursing is probably not for you because you have so much testing ahead of you in nursing.
Right. Just to be licensed and
exactly. It would almost be malpractice to let in a student who's not even a good test taker, even if they're very brilliant, because they might not be, they might go through a lot of schooling and a lot of money and a lot of work and then not be able to, get to their goal.
But the question of like, it doesn't matter whether you're submitting an ACT or an SAT. It's whatever you think you're going to perform better on.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, another really good question. Somebody's asking, and I'm just going to summarize it. That basically, do you feel that like the test score percentiles that are shared on the whether on the college website or on the common data set, have they been inflated over the past few years because the fact that during COVID and during the height of the test optional period, only the students with the best scores were submitting them. So hasn't that kind of shifted all of those ranges to look better?
The test scores are totally inflated. Yeah, absolutely. Which is another reason why, like now, if you're between the 25th and 50th percentile, that's still a really good score for that school because, that was probably above their median if you look 4 years ago. So, yes, it's all inflated. And you do see that once a school goes back to test required, it usually does have some type of drop back to normalcy with its ranges.
So here's a question just about the process, and maybe you can explain this, David, about when students sign up, they have sometimes they're asked, do you want to send your score without even knowing what the score is? Maybe do you want to explain all of that and what your thoughts are about when students should submit their scores to the college and and when they shouldn't, and kind of when they can self-report and all that type of stuff?
Fantastic question. So, I wish that the SAT and ACT let you send your scores later for free. So if finances is really a very limiting factor, then yeah, sure, you can send your scores for free to 4 institutions when you register. The problem is you lose the optionality to send in or not send in your scores later to them. So personally, if it's at all possible for you, I would not put down any colleges on that list when you're registering, because then you get your scores, and well, technically your high school gets your scores as well, but they're not releasing it. So you get your score and you have full control over it. Now with the SAT, you can pick and choose which test dates you want to send to colleges. That's called score choice. Most schools allow you to use score choice. There's very few schools, like Georgetown says, no, you can't use score choice. I would say don't use, send in all of your scores. To be frank, a lot of students still don't send in all of their scores to Georgetown, because
Georgetown, it doesn't have any way of
Exactly.
really knowing,
Right.
it's just an honor system.
Exactly. Now, the ACT makes that easier because you can delete ACT scores for free at any time. So that's very helpful for a couple reasons. One, it takes the pressure off of test day. That's good for students' mental health, but it's also good for their performance, that they're not freaking out about everything. Then they can take the real test as a practice test as well. So, you might go into a test prep center and take a mock test. Well, just go in and take the real test. And you don't like the score, just delete it. And if you have a really good day, you have a good day with a test that fits your content knowledge well, with a test that has a good curve, maybe at least in one section, you've reached your score goal, right? So it's the best possible practice. And if you like your score, you lock it in. So I would say, you just take the tests really, honestly, as many times as you want, unless you're applying to maybe Georgetown and you're taking the SAT. But if you're applying to Georgetown and you're taking the ACT, you can still delete any scores you don't want sent. And then when Georgetown says, send all of your scores, you're actually doing that. Because if you took the test 6 times and you delete 4, you can't send the deleted 4 even if you wanted to. So.
And a lot of schools, just so everybody knows, in the admissions process, they allow students to self-report. So you don't even have to really pay until the student is accepted, and then they ask for, your proof of, and at that point you have to send something from the ACT or SAT. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. So somebody's asking, any thoughts about super scoring these days? Is that going to still happen, do you know, by colleges?
So, virtually all schools super score the SAT except like Georgetown. But it's like maybe 60-70% of schools super score the ACT. In general, the big state schools are less likely to super score the ACT. Also, some of the very, top Ivy Leagues, some of them don't super score the ACT. We will see what happens with the ACT scores once the science is no longer in the composite. So what the ACT has currently said is that starting in September, all students, whether or not they took the new ACT or didn't take the new ACT, all students' super scores will just be English, math, and reading. And science will become separate for the super score itself. So, we'll see if students' super scores, even on then colleges are more likely as well to just super score from English, math, and reading.
Oh, here's a good comment. Somebody is saying some high schools offer dual enrollment with local colleges for college credit, and often for AP classes. So some students are opting for this route to take the dual enrollment for potential college credit instead of taking the AP exam. And this might be a reason why some kids might not be taking AP tests. Very true and still valid.
Yeah, and just a note about that. So a lot of students at the time probably wisely took that route because it's a lot easier to get an A in one of those classes than it is to get a 5 on the AP exam. Now, 2 things happened. One, colleges got wise to that. So as far as I know, if they could pick between a dual enrollment and a 5 on an AP exam or the AP class and 5 would look significantly more impressive. But the second thing is that the College Board, which it gets $500 million from AP exams and $300 million from the SAT. So it's really an AP exam company more than it is an SAT company. They were losing market share to dual enrollment, so they inflated all of their AP exam scores. So it's now much easier to get, just as of 2 years ago, much easier to get a 4 and a 5 than it was before, because they wanted to make it easier to get 4s and 5s, so students would pick to take the AP class instead of dual enrollment. But I'm not sure if that's helpful.
So a parent is saying that their student is a junior and she's really firm on only wanting to apply to test optional schools and she's not doing any test prep to even apply, take the SAT. It sounds like the parent wants them to take the test. Any advice, David, to help encourage a student to maybe spend a little bit more time preparing?
Teenagers are tough. So, the first thing that I would try and just say is just convince the kid, look, the SAT is 2 hours and 14 minutes, right? The ACT is 2 hours and 55 minutes. Just go in, take the test, see how you do. That's step one. Now, the score might be so low at that point that you then agree with the kid and you're like, no, I'm not going to pay, a ton of money for you to get some massive increase to where a test score becomes helpful, because it really depends on what schools you're applying to. So like if you're applying to University of Tennessee, okay, like a 26 might actually start helping you get into the University of Tennessee. So, if you're starting at a 24, it might make sense even to do prep if you're applying to University of Tennessee. University of Tennessee is test required. But for the vast majority of schools, you only really need to submit test scores usually if you're at like a 30 or above on the ACT or like 1370 or above on the SAT. So if a student takes the test and they're at like 17 on the ACT or like a 900 on the SAT, then I would probably agree in most cases, don't spend the time on the prep. And you're probably going to apply test optional regardless, and that's probably the route for you. So it depends on the school. And it depends on the starting scores. Now, if you really want your kid to do test prep, I think you just need to frame it as one, scholarships, right? Money. But number two, you have to have a conversation about their future and tie in test scores to their future. Like, hey, what do you want out of life?
Or maybe honestly, David, just going back to your comment about sometimes it's just making sure that they have the fundamentals. So
yeah, absolutely.
So like if this parent is kind of saying it sounds like it's the math part of the test. I mean, your daughter is going to have to do math at some point. So maybe it's really addressing that she doesn't feel comfortable enough in math, period, whether or not it's for the test, the ACT, and just help her get better math skills.
Yeah, and we've had students who they are starting at like a 16 on math, and we don't even call it test prep. We just call it academic enrichment then, where we teach them the math and we, test them on the ACT or the SAT then, and we're just trying to get them up to average then. So we're just trying to get them to a 20 on the ACT math or, a 500 on the SAT math, because we know that that will help them in college and in life.
Period.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so there's been a few questions, so maybe you can repeat this, David, because I think you piqued people's interest to describe the fact of that you can just the whole you don't have to sign up and have your tests go to a college, and you can actually delete them on the ACT. Maybe just describe that again, because people I think never heard about the deleting, and they're kind of interested to make sure they are understanding it correctly.
Yeah, so I would say I've never had a student use it actually, because you don't need to, because
unless you're applying to like a Georgetown.
Correct. Yeah. Because you can just pick and choose which test dates you want to send, right? But yes, to Georgetown, yes, you would want to actually go through and delete them. But I tell students about it because it gives them that peace of mind. Because there's so much pressure on these tests that if a kid knows, hey, I can delete this, then in their minds, it's truly a practice test then. So they probably won't ever delete it. they just won't send it in when they apply to colleges. But if you do delete it, and to go through the process, I deleted one of my ACT scores from high school. And so I know that it works. I talked to the ACT, I went through the process, I just emailed them, I got an emailed them back. Within 2 hours, I had one of my test scores deleted, right? And then there's no record of it at all. So very easy. You can do it anytime for free, very easy.
Parents asking if a student is happy with their language score, with I guess the reading score, but they ran out of time on math. Can they retake just the math to try and get a better score?
No, but you can get pretty strategic with things. So, like to your point, Debbie, about self-reporting. So what it actually looks like, actually, I'll probably just share my screen again because this will just be easier. So I'm just going to log into my practice account for the Common App. And you'll actually see what it looks like with the self-reporting. So this is exactly what it looks like for students. They'll go to testing. So let's say they're taking the ACT. It says number of past ACT scores you wish to report. Not how many have you taken, but how many do you wish to report. And then you can only put in your highest, this is literally all you can put in. Your highest ever composite, highest ever English, highest ever math, highest ever reading, highest ever science. And again, this might change actually in this next admission cycle. The science will probably be some separate score, like you put in a separate writing score. But anyway, so like let's say that you have a score that you want on the English, whatever it is, but your math is I don't know, low, right? Well, let's say on the next ACT that a student takes, they get a 20 on the English. They can't even report that 20 on the English. There's no place to put in that 20. They can't report it if they wanted to, if they're self-reporting. So then really they only need to worry about getting that math score up. So because when you apply, almost all colleges allow you to self-report, and this is the only information they get. If you're accepted and you enroll, then they have you send your official score report so they can just verify that you were telling the truth. Well, at that point, if they see that you got a 20 on the English one time, they're not going to rescind your offer because you didn't lie. You literally, as long as you got that 34 one time, that's all they care about. So it's the same thing for the SAT as well. So, let's say a student has, locked in, they got a 770 one time and, their math is lower. They can psychologically take it as just a math test because even if they get a, 640, they can't report it. They can only report their highest ever. We also all of us have reserves of focus. And so if you can, when you have to split your reserve of focus over 2 hours and 14 minutes, you can't expend, as much awareness and focus at any given time. But when you treat it as just a math test, you go all in, and usually you actually do see a higher score because you can put all of your mental energy on just that, just the math.
Somebody's asking, David, if you can talk a little bit to compare the math difficulty between the ACT and the SAT.
Good question. So ACT math goes up to a slightly higher level. So you're going to see a little bit more algebra 2, a little bit more trigonometry, and a little bit higher level algebra 2 and trigonometry than you would see on the SAT. But again, it's more straightforward on those topics. So it's like higher level, but I would say more straightforward. To me, that balances it out. So there's 160 math topics on the ACT. There's 120 math topics on the SAT. So yes, you need to learn more topics for ACT, but on the SAT, they're trying to trick you. So your mileage may vary, which one works best for you.
Would you say like the SAT math seems to me like more theoretical as opposed to the ACT? When I've looked at those questions, they're difficult, but they're practical.
Yes.
Or applied, more applied math.
Yeah, the SAT, they're trying to, again, it still goes back to its origin of an aptitude test, where they're trying to test you on fundamentals in new ways that you've never been tested on. to see if you can apply it in new novel ways that you were never asked in school. Whereas ACT, it's just like, hey, can you do this question that you would have seen in school, basically, more or less.
So somebody's asking if, and this might be the student, if I focus on ACT preparation the summer before my junior year, should they also kind of switch and focus on some SAT prep if they want to do well on the PSAT?
Good question. I almost never advise to prep for the PSAT because the PSAT, your PSAT, you'll only get, national merit if you're in the top, well, you're only in the running for it if you score in the top 1% of your state on the PSAT. So then it also varies on state. I'm in New Jersey. New Jersey has some of the highest standardized test scores in the country. So to get into the top 1% of the PSAT in New Jersey, for instance, you almost need a perfect score. So 99% of the time, I'm advising students, no, don't, still take the PSAT. It's good practice. But I'm not telling them to prep for that score. There's some limiting factor, or some qualifying factors, like if a parent works in finance or consulting, some of those firms will give you a full scholarship if you become a national merit semifinalist or finalist or scholar. Okay, now it might be worth it to prep for the PSAT. But the vast majority of the time, I would say, figure out, is the SAT better for you? Is the ACT better for you? Whichever is better for you, focus on that. 99% of the time, ignore don't prep for the PSAT.
Okay. Well, thanks, David. Lots of great questions, lots of good stats and data on test optional to give people lots to think about. And hopefully we have families here who, with juniors and sophomores, so you've got time to plan it out, particularly the sophomores and still the juniors. I always advise people to start as early as possible to just plan it out, because it's so heart-wrenching when I have students and parents kind of show up at the last minute, and you can't fit stuff in that needed like a year's worth of preparation. So
Absolutely.
okay, so everybody will be receiving an email. David's company, Summit Prep, we are partners with them, for test prep. And if you want to do any work with David and with Summit Prep, and you actually tell them that you're from Road to College, you get a $5 discount on the hourly rate. So remember that if you're going to be interested in finding out and doing any test prep. And then just also check out our emails, because David and his team have been coming up with some interesting, I call them little smaller classes that might help your student. Like we have a class, this is the second or the third one that's happening, just on Desmos, how to use the Desmos calculator. It's happening on Sundays. So that's like a 2-hour concentrated class and really helpful for students. So just make sure you open the emails and see what we have coming your way.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye.